Thank you for coming for today's events. I am Susanna Halsey, the event producer for the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, aka SVU in New York. I will be your host today, since our usual moderator par excellence, our president, Christopher Harwood, had an emergency change plan. So I'm stepping outside my comfort zone, where I usually am behind the scenes. So I hope you will be patient with the occasional snafus that may occur. At this point, I would like to thank the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association for its ongoing support, as well as you, and you know who I mean, who support us individually. Thanks also are due to the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the grants supporting our YouTube channel. Speaking of which, I'd like to alert you to the new video that I just posted on of our last in-person event. Philip Schierf of National Museum had presented a story of a 1895 Czech immigrant at the Jedlička and his pioneering sound recording of Czech cultural life in New York, actually near the Bohemian National Hall. I would like to also alert you to our next coming up attraction, which is a story of Wojciech Náprostek, and Michael Schouten, all the way from Scotland, will provide an overview of the fascinating life of this man, and who is his ancestor, Wojciech Náprostek, Czech patriot, ethnographer, a person who loved progress. Since 1848, Náprostek spent several years in America in exile from the Austro-Hungarian authorities. And he actually received the US citizenship. And during his stay in America, he explored the culture of Native Americans and later founded a museum in Prague, first on the site of his mother's brewery. And later in 1866, he rebuilt it into today's Náprostek Museum of Asian, African, and Native American Art. And it's well worth visiting. So now I am happy to welcome our today's guest speaker, Dr. Jana Kopelent-Rehak. Dr. Kopelent-Rehak is a busy woman. She's an educator, cultural anthropologist, photographer, artist, filmmaker, and mother of 2 daughters. Jana is currently on the faculty at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins University. She received her PhD in anthropology in 2006 from American University, Washington, D.C., her MFA in 1997 from the University of Delaware, and BA in film and photography in 1993 from the famed Film FAMU Academy in Prague. Today, she will discuss her 2 books, including stories of men and women who survived the communist Czechoslovak concentration camps. And later, she will explore how humor can provide a nonviolent form of political protest and space for restoring human dignity. Both books, although written in 2012 and 2019, are more relevant than ever in today's climate. And so now I give you Dr. Jana Kopelent. Take it away, Jana.
Thank you for such a wonderful introduction and invitation to be here. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we have also with us today my colleague Neringa Klumbate, who is Latvian American scholar, and she was a major contributor to our book, The Politics of Joking, and also wrote acknowledgement in front. And so when I get to the second book, I want you to know she's here. She contributed with chapter and introduction, and she's someone to turn to also for questions, and I like to include her in our conversation. Susanna Trnka, who was my main co-author, I don't think is with us today, but she is a partner in crime in a way, and she is a Czech origins, but lives in New Zealand. So it is definitely a collective kind of project, and I want to emphasize that right in the beginning. So this first book, Czech Political Prisoners, was originally my doctoral dissertation that I reworked later for publication. I should emphasize that it is academic publication. However, on many levels, it is dearly a personal book because I am originally from Czech. I lived through some of the times that I described, and I also had very intimate, friendly relationship with many of the prisoners that I have interviewed. And so the book for me has multiple meanings in many ways, and it was a long-term project. So as an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist with focus on political processes in Central Eastern Europe, I have applied very specific methodologies and theories, but I also, more than anything, tell the story of men and women who were selected by a totalitarian communist regime to be liquidated. The men and women disappeared, were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and put on trial. They were convicted and sentenced to forced labor camp. In 1948, or I should say between 48 and 50, any resistance was defined by state as a betrayal, and the political other was clearly marked and stripped of self-citizenship, definitely, and alienated from other citizens. I left Czechoslovakia, or Czech Republic, I should say, in 1994, and my coming to US was connected to the fact that I met my husband in Prague. He was American. We got married and he invited me to come and live in US. It was really first time for me to be away for such a long time. And I realized after a year coming back to Prague, I still had many unresolved feelings about the past, about our shared past, about the memories. Having that distance for a year away from the country somehow sparked this desire for reconciliation. And I remember walking through Prague and looking at the people's faces and thinking, I wonder if they feel the same way. And then one Sunday morning, I was in a Prague cafe, Louvre. I was there with my students at that time that I brought from US. And I saw a group of men sitting at the table. And I was curious about them. So I walked up to them. As at that time photographer, filmmaker, I felt with something we just simply do. We are curious about people and we walk up to them and ask them, who are you? And so I did. And it turned out that they were, they first looked at each other and they said, well, we worked together in 50s. And sit down and they started to tell me a story how they were, they call themselves mukls, muklině, which is the term they used, men, women selected for liquidation in Czech language. And they said that they were arrested in 1948. And so the very small group on a Sunday morning that I met, I realized that they're friends and they meet once a week, every week on a Sunday. And so that summer, I began to get to know about their personal experiences, get to know them as a people who sit down around the table and drink coffee or have a glass of wine. And I wanted to know more. I have, at that particular summer, asked them if I could photograph them, and I set up a small studio in one of the small rooms, conference rooms in a restaurant, and I photographed the individual Mughals, and then I conducted life history narratives, oral interviews with each person. And that first year it was about 8 people, and then I left for US. And it was not until next summer that I came back and I searched. I found that they were still meeting at the Cafe Ganis. And so I would meet more of men. And I also found out that they had political organization of political prisoners. They are men and women, both meet regularly monthly for much larger meeting than this one in a Cafe Ganes. And I, of course, as it is when you do field work as an anthropologist, connected with 1 or 3 Mughals more intensely. And like this man, Jiří, who was an immigrant from Czech to Germany and returned after Velvet Revolution, we became close friends and spent a lot of time. So some of the Mughals I interviewed in the life histories, through life histories, but others I got to know through kind of every day of being together. My father and my grandfather both were photographers, and we had a family portrait studio in a southwest Czech, in a small town where I'm from, Sušice. And so growing up, I witnessed my father and grandfather photographing people, and I always felt that portraits bring certain story of the face that fade into the face, and that face can be the window and insight into people's stories. But there was also opportunity for me to, in some way, through these portraits, reconcile their invisibility they spoke about during the regime that I will address and talk to you later about. And so I take these photographs as faces that are being recovered after '89. Gaining visibility was part of reconciliation when Mughals gathered in public spaces, when they celebrate their suffering, and when they try to gain public face. Being in a public space openly together as a community was very important to them, as a part of telling story that was hidden in the secrecy of the government. What was interesting for me right in the beginning, when I was conducting life histories, narratives, recording, that men were always open to connect individually. I could set up appointments, I could invite them to my apartment. Women were not so. They always wanted to come in small group, or at least 2, which was an interesting difference at that time. This woman was different from the rest of the group. I have a different relationship with her. She was my mentor. She was someone I met when I was 17 in Prague. I was expelled from a boarding school dormitory because they found some literature that was not desirable. And through friends, I was able to find a small room renting from Milu. Her name is Miloslava Holubová. She was a very famous Czech art historian, writer, philosopher. And so I included her into my book and into this storytelling because she was in many ways someone I got to know in great depth, and I got to know her experiences. I also got to know what she lived, what life is like every day for her in time that was during 80s. And so I could not imagine, even though she was not from the ordinary prisoners, she was the intellectual, she was the lead, one of the main players in Czech intellectual underground. I thought it was important that she is part of the story. And so I'm making through my photographs visual argument about returning the face to people who were defaced under communist regime, who lost their face and who desired this possibility of recovery that photography may offer. These are some points I will be addressing today. I'm going to walk you through book as I explore certain topics. So I talk about this defacement and the invisibility, or gaining, restoring visibility after 1989. And so the book is not just about past, it's not just about memories, it's about memories constituted in the time that I was conducting these interviews. And I begin really in 1995, but then systematically returned every summer and recorded more people. I went to archives, I visited memorial sites, and my very last year that I conducted my field work was in, I believe, 2005. I will talk to you about my theoretical perception through this anthropological theory of violence, specifically state-produced violence, but also in relation to subjectivity, meaning how that violence was experienced. So I do emphasize experiences of people rather than just reporting on state violent doings or historical processes. I talked about experience of citizenship, kinship under violence. And then at the end, just before I talk to you about language of humor and linguistic spaces of freedom within violence, I will address idea of political fiction and archive. So one big obstacle I had was, how do I approach this subject from anthropological perspective? And when I met with Jacques Rupnik, a Czech French philosopher and political theorist, he suggested or invited me or challenged me with this question: how do you address this subject, this topic, being anthropologist, but also not from the perspective of victimhood? Rupnik argued that to me that that time, that 20th century is a time of victimhood, and that I need to be careful and cautious about that, which made a lot of sense to me, because if I do plan on representing at that time, I thought, as political prisoners, as from their perspective, from their experiential perspective, I have never got sense that they felt that they were really victims. And I will explain this as I talked about them. So I decided the main framework, theoretical framework, would be the ritual of violence, and trying to see their becoming prisoners as a journey through violent rituals of the state. So more in the motion of becoming subject of the state, and also how that then shaped the way people felt about themselves, their not necessarily identity. I do not use that so much as subjectivity. So this sort of felt experience by being put through what I call space of death. In classic traditional anthropological theories, many have referred to ritual as a kind of time in between normality, between ordinary, time when we enter the space where often we may, that transfers us through this nearness to death. And I felt this was particularly relevant. And many prisoners talked about a moment of arrest. And so I decided that after doing analysis of their interviews, that I will take an arrest as one of the themes, topics that I will begin the book with. And so here is an example. I take ethnographic episodes, ethnographic moments, thick, rich moments, and turn them into the beginnings of chapters in my book. This is Czech Slovak. Czech was the ambassador. He was working for the Canadian embassy in Prague when he was arrested. And he described to me when I visited him in his apartment I believe, sixth floor over, living over Prague rooftops with a beautiful view of Prague Castle, yet also view down into courtyard, Prague typical courtyard of the not so typical Bartolomějská, where secret police station was. And Czech saw me looking down and he said, yeah, that's it. That's the place where I have been taken in chains. And I looked up and I saw my mother standing on the balcony, looking down. And that was the last time I saw her. She died when I was in the prison. Families suffered with prisoners when people were arrested. Typically, they disappeared into the night. Their families didn't know where they were for a long time. They would be made invisible until really trials, when they were put on a trials. Families often lost their homes. Their children could no longer attend universities or high schools. And many felt alienated along with the Mughals, while Mughals were then in the prisons. So I talked about kinship relatedness and how this experience transformed or changed the way that kinship was experienced for prisoners. František Boblík, who was arrested, told me when he was in a prison, his son was born, his wife was pregnant when he was arrested, and that he saw him after many years. He was not allowed to touch him, hold him, and just see him from distance. So he talked about how he was stripped or robbed of the parenthood, fatherhood. And when he returned, in some ways, in 60s, this feeling continued. He one day he was approached by his son, who said, "Daddy, would you come to meet me at the school tomorrow, so that other children can see that I also have daddy?" So, growing up as a child of political prisoner was in many ways trauma that many experienced. Rudolf Pernický, who was very famous general in Czech army who fought during the Second World War, Nazi regime, said that to me that it was cruel irony for him to be marked as the enemy of the state, because it was in 1939 when proudly he was serving the country as a soldier fighting Nazis. And so in 1948, when he was arrested and eventually accused of betrayal and ended up in a prison with life sentence first, and then sitting for 11.5 years. He in Bori and various labor camps, he was always kept in isolation. It was the fact that he was survivor of Second World War fight that made him a dangerous enemy of the state more than anybody else. There was this general philosophy: if you survive Nazism, you're so strong and powerful that we consider you extremely dangerous. So people who were, they call themselves Vlastenets, patriots, during the Second World War, were seen by communist regime in 50s, the most dangerous. Albina talked about secrecy that was built into a time of torture. She described to me how they were women that were in Prague prison, Pankrác, transported to Bartolomějská police station for interrogations. She described how they were taken in the bus and they could see out from bus outside people walking on the streets, but people couldn't see in. And so she said to me, that was the most painful thing for me to see people, this was before Christmas, walking in and out of shops, holding packages. They were getting ready for Christmas, and yet nobody noticed us. There was the feeling of helplessness, she says. How can they do nothing? How can they live their ordinary life while we were suffering so much, living as invisible in a sacred darkness? She expressed the pain through this, I think it's kind of a scopic regime of invisibility. And I talk about this in a great length in my book, how there were multiple ways people were tortured before the trial, and how from regime's perspective, this was preparation. Anishka was one of the older prisoners I met. She was arrested. She was a few women that I met that when she was arrested was already married with children. She said to me, I had the Russian interrogator who had a revolver on the table, and he was screaming at me, "You bitch, I would like to shoot you," he said in Czech language. And then he beat me so long until I told him, I hope that your mother will one time experience what I did too. And then she said he stopped after that. But this, this people often ask me what is the relationship between these interrogators and prisoners who are tortured and interrogated. And it has been written up, I think, before, especially in relation to Second World War. What possibly happened in that space of torture. Torture was a very difficult thing to write about for me, because I was very conscious about to not be voyeuristic about their pain, to not make this what Suzanne Sontag calls sort of pornography of pain or violence. So I decided to write about this from the perspective of the time that I sit down and people were talking, and sometimes they paused in a silence, sometimes they had tears, and sometimes they said it as a very matter of fact, almost like rehearsed story that needed to be said. I remember asking Milu what it was like to go through interrogations, what made her strong and what made her to survive. And she said, it seemed that people that have strong kinship bonds, a good family life, good family relationships were much stronger. And then she gave me an example how one time after interrogating, she came back to a cell. Another woman right away took care of her and let her rest, and she fell asleep. And she had this very vivid dream in which her mother says to her, "Milushko, you know what? Let's go to the garden. That would be best of all." And she said, these were moments between interrogations. We were let to rest. just that to be interrogated again, soon again. And so I talk about the dreams, and I talk about, just like I talk about humor, emotional experiences. Women also talked about the gendered pain, something they called crinkling with silk, šustění hedvábím. Dagmar Šimková, who later emigrated to Australia, wrote in her memoir about these famous games that interrogators play with women, where they would not let them wear fitting clothes, long baggy clothes. They didn't let them during interrogations go to bathrooms, so they pee all over themselves, and then they called them bitches, smelly horse, beast. And so she said in her book, as an anti-poison, we call ourselves diminutives, Marušky, Pepičky, Aničky. We conduct these ritual of beautifications where we comb our hair, we did our makeup, we took care of ourselves with the kind and gentleness to counter the kind of cruelness that we have experienced during the interrogations. And we call that šustění hedvábím. As a way of restoring our femininity or womanhood that they try to take away from us. Čeněk was brutally interrogated. He described how he was tied naked to a chair, beaten, electrocuted, hanged out of balcony, to confess, to make the confessed. And yet he said, when I asked him about pain and cruelty, he actually was very humbled and didn't want to talk about his own pain. And he talked about others. He would say, you know, I was okay, I could take it, but it was others who suffered more. And I found that really interesting, that when I was conducting interviews, they often emphasize the pain of others, not themselves. It was during interrogations that I believe many of prisoners' experiences what I call the fiction of file making. All of them and most of other people who were somehow uncomfortable to regime had their personal file, so-called state police, secret police files, STB files. And while after '89, many of these files were taken as a place of truth, I argue in my book that these were a place of fiction, because many of them begin in this time of interrogations. That's when this archive was made. And it was made out of pain, and people were forced to sign after they were tortured. And many of them didn't, and some probably did. But it was then that I think continuity by this regime was begin in some ways, because after regime fell in 1989, the archive continues, and this place of so-called truth that I think was more of a fictional was used for prisoners to be, for example, excluded from their own party. It's also the place where their children and grandchildren would go or would be held accountable. And so there were some instances where prisoners suffered even physical pain after archives were revealed. And there were unfortunate marks made that one can never prove whether they were true or not. The third chapter of my book is focus on trials, infamous so-called monster trials that were conducted in 50s. They were public trials where muggles were often brought into courtroom in numbers of 30 or more, and all of them were accused of betrayal. Albina talked about the preparation for trial, and just before the trial, she told me that they were allowed to wash and put on clean clothes so that others' relatives can see that they were treated well. She said she refused. What I found interesting was, she said, when I entered the courtroom, my eyes spotted audience behind the bars. So there is again that, desperate trying to understand and comprehend how others can watch this injustice, how others can live this fiction right then. It seemed to be, I think, one of the pains, great psychological pains that especially women would talk about, but men as well. Where were the others when this was happening to us? Anishka said, I couldn't recognize my husband. They beat him so that he looked horrible. She also told me that she agreed, or they had agreement in a family, that if they were arrested, because they had private business, they had a furniture shop, a furniture making shop, and they wanted to somehow make sure that can continue for their children. So she said she will take on blame for whatever they're being charged with. So she did, and she got 22 years and her husband got 4. So judicial failure for many prisoners at that time is very important in a time of reconciliation. Government established, totalitarian government established new law. The one infamous one was K231, under which anybody really could be accused of betrayal and sentenced to labor camps in prison or death sentence, which happened to Milada Horáková, for example. And so the law became a symbolic, in some way, failure to protect their sense of citizenship and justice. And it also then became very important to them in time of reconciliation to go back to courtroom, which happened for some but didn't for most people. After trial, they were sentenced to labor camps. Many of them spent as much as 10, 11 years working in uranium mines, coal mines for men. For women, it was in agriculture, factories, for example, jewelry making factory, glass making factory, ironically, factories that produce Czech flags and other national symbols that were made by women prisoners. I will just present, for example, one. There were many places that I visited with Mughals as they returned to these in June, which is a memorial month for Czech political prisoners. And one of them is Jáchymov. Jáchymov is a small town in northwest Czech. It is a town that's very famous for its curative healing, as a curative healing place because of the sanatorium that has the waters, curative waters with the uranium in, and that was built in between wars, I believe. But it is also a place of hell, as prisoners would say, place where many prisoners had to work with no protection, no gloves. They joked we would come out of mines and we would shine. They also talked about Russian supervision, how this camp was organized and supervised by Russians who were interested in a lot of uranium was exported to Russia. It is also uranium mining where Germans were very interested and where Madame Curie got her uranium. So a place of multiple meanings in some way. This place, as I said, became a place of returns. Ironically, some would say coming back, it's like coming back home. And they had memorial weekends in June that I visited. This is me a long time ago. And we would walk through area together with other Mughals, and I would listen to how they remember. This was very important methodologically for me, because even though I had recorded narratives about these spaces of death for Mughals, coming back to actual place made them remember and retell the stories that happened, and made it for me more, I could imagine better. And I could capture some of the language that then led into second book about humor. Jiří was one of the people who joked all the time. He couldn't stop joking. So he was somebody I would return with to these places, but he said the need to connect was incredible. We were practically in a time of imprisonment, the only free people in this country. We can think and say what we wanted because we already lost everything. We had nothing else to lose. So in the second part of my book, I switched to, in a way, more of a present time, and I discuss or describe this time that I spent with Mughals returning and meeting, and I describe what it's like to be in the Mughalhood now in the time of 2003, 2004, 5, 6. And so when visiting, beyond ceremonial sounds is the silence of survivors who long ago tortured bodies, hands, arms, shoulders, face, as well as thoughts are engaged in these shared moments of togetherness. This is exempt from book, and I think people, I was told that it is always powerful to quote Mughals directly in my presentations, so I am including a lot of that here. The affection, camaraderie, tenderness and kindness was very evident from these meetings. Roman Sakmar told me, in the camps, when you get to know people, you really see what they're like naked. Their soul and mind is in training, meaning always there, always trialed. He also talked about how in the camps it was intellectuals, but also workers, ironically, people of all kinds, but including criminals and Nazi collaborants until 1951, when Nazi collaborants were released on amnesty and prisoner state. But until then, prisoners were in same spaces with Nazi collaborants, and who were treated actually much better than political prisoners, from what my understanding is. But also, ironically, some of them were doctors, and they were in a higher position in these prisons and camps. And so imagine what it is like when you are someone who fought during the Second World War, and now you are in your own country, imprisoned by your own people, being taken care of by former Nazi doctor. So these were very difficult moments, absurdity, one could say. And how do you live through this absurdity? And what I learned again through these visits to disappeared camps was that what American anthropologist Michael Jackson says about these absurd moments of human suffering, that if it was just us, only us that we care for alone in solitude, it would indeed be absurd. But we as humans are always connected to others. We always have these ties to strings attached to others from who we care. And that makes difference. Through that care, through that embodied relationship, we endure, we suffer, we endure, we survive. And so I realized when being together with Mughals, returning to these places that are gone now, empty, in a way, this was a camp, work camp, where you see right here, where barracks were built, where they lived, and being taken to mines every day. When we walk through, they, of course, remember hunger, cold, sleep deprivation, daily suffering. They also remember humor, joking. They remember various visual moments, like looking at the nature, looking in the green forest, and enjoying it for what it is. And so I think it would be right to say that, there was tremendous amount of suffering in this time of, as they say, waiting for this to crack, waiting for this to end. This can't end. Often prisoners talk about their mindset in the prisons is a time of waiting for outside world to interfere and end this hell. And in that time of waiting, they worked hard and they suffered, but they also filled that with joking, play, friendship, caring. Karel, one of the prisoners, says, here was the gate, entrance to the camp. I closed my eyes and I see it all. Kitchen, laundry room, built on concrete frames. Barracks that we lived were built on wooden pillings. You could see your breath. These buildings were not isolated. Temperature never rose above 0 in the winter. And Karel said, and then the most beautiful view, but we could never see it because they're in between were dividers. And then they joked, oh, that was planned architecture, that we could never see it fully. And they call it Killer Valley. What was interesting, during this conversation, I realized they described to me various skits and joking and performances that they did, even though they knew they would be punished and sentenced to correction for that. But I realized that there was this linguistic switch, almost like a code switching, what we call, where they would go from the language of pain and suffering to laughter and humor, as if humor provided the space for empowerment or recovery then in the prisons, but also now in the time that we were at the camp. And they described this, what they call Russian bus, when a formation of men, I believe hundreds of men, 500 actually, 500 of men. So I'm looking at my notes. See, Susanna, what happens when I don't read? I messed numbers up. So 500 of men walking in this Russian bus formation, surrounded by wires, dogs often. And as they described me this, one of the men said, yeah, there was an eclipse of the sun, and I took a little glass and put it over fire and smoke it up. So as we were walking, I could see the eclipse. And so these were moments, glimpses of beauty that didn't disappear, that hold them, that kept them, helped them to work through what was unbearable. One of the men, Karel Šťastný, who emigrated to Switzerland, shared with me his cartoons. And I have them in my book translated, just not here. But you could see from his drawings that the commander or the guard was always depicted as a bigger. And typically there is the stupidity expressed through all these speeches, the kind of a self-stupidity, maybe one could say connect somehow to even Czech soldier Schweik in some ways. And again, if you do want to see, I could possibly send you translation, or you could see it in my book. Like this one is simple on the left. The guard says to them, you say about us that we're stupid, but we know it. So there was a play with the language, and there was a play with the power, and there was always this sense that guards, prison guards or interrogators were stupid, dumb, and prisoners often felt that it was very clear and visible, and that also helped them to create a certain distance. So language patterns of joking were in what I call joking relations, which is the term that we used in anthropology in relation to some cultures where people are prescribed to joke in certain situations. And this was unexpected in many ways. Prisoners joked among themselves in prisons. They were playful with language. They kept a certain playfulness through language. To change in some ways the dark stories into lightness, but they also, of course, joked about guards, and when they came back from prisons, they joked, continued joking together as they gathered and remembered through reconciliation. So I think humor in many ways was inseparable from condition of Mukhalhood, and it didn't really in many ways dawn on me until the end of my research time, when I had that time to spend with prisoners and I saw what they were like as a community, how there was a strong bond and camaraderie that brought them together through that violent ritual of initiation to Mukhalhood. And so I write about this at the end, but really that was inspiration for calling on other colleagues to get together, like Neringa, and invite them to write together about politics of humor, the role of humor in political life in many ways. In anthropology, some of my colleagues talk about performing jokes, performing humor. So one can think of it as a linguistic or reenacted performance that always has multiple meanings to connect people, but to also reverse powers. Czech talked about humor. He, as he would say, joke that he played on guards in 60s when he became a radio station producer about 50s. And so he went back in 60s. That was a relative freedom. So he went back to Bore prison when he was in prison for many years. And he was interviewing some of the guards, pretending that he has never been there. And so he said, what can you tell me about 50s here? And the guards were denying. They were pretending that nothing happened there. And then Czech said right there on the spot, you're lying. I was here. I know everything that was happening. And so when Czech told me this story that happened, he said it was the joke I play on them. And that was the kind of, I think, desired satisfaction that he had, to be able to face the guard and call it a joke I play on him. I think meant a lot in the process of reconciliation and coming to terms with what happened, this lived fiction, which led to this book that came second. And it was, for me, interesting journey. I was exhausted from working alone on that topic, but I really wanted to get this out to emphasize how there was the polarity or the other side to experience of Mukhalhood. And also, I realized at that time that we do have in anthropology works on humor and joking, but not so much from contemporary times. And I thought it would be useful to work together with others and create this kind of cross-cultural perspective on humor. And so, of course, question was for many of us, when can you joke, and where, and what can you joke about? That I think was one of these questions that united many of contributions whether some of the authors in this book wrote about the social aspects, imagination or intentionality, absurdity. I know Neringa uses this book in her linguistic classes, and maybe she can share with us something about how students, American students, respond to this. I have used it once in small group, and but I know you have much greater experience. This may be a good time to pause and invite you in.
Hello, everybody. It's a great honor to join Jana in this special event celebrating her books and her research. And I have always been very excited about Jana's accomplishments and her. So I don't know where you lost me, but I will say that I have always been very excited about Jana's research that represents very deep layers of kind of human existence and experience. So this has been something what fascinated me, and I was very happy to contribute my own short chapter to Jana's book. But I give parts of the book, not everything, but I give your article. It's and what students love very much is, I don't know, I guess it's partly what I love too, is that you very much, like in your presentation now, with are able to uncover those stories and those deep layers of people's experience through a lot of sensitivity. And humor, of course, itself is a special analytics that captures in a multifaceted way through emotions, through morality, through aesthetics, what's going on in life. And it is a political statement in the cases like you discuss. So I
wonder if you could tell us something about your chapter or how that led to your book, maybe too, because I know you have a new book out that was probably happening simultaneously already then.
Yeah, we have been, I guess, working on similar projects at the same time. My book is Authoritarian Laughter. It's on Soviet humor, on how the majority of humor that is in your book is about what Orwell told us, that humor and every joke is a tiny revolution. It's about resistance. And your talk today also emphasized how humor could be a form of restoration of dignity, how it could be a form of resistance, how it could be a way of overcoming those absurdities in life, and a form of liberation, which is very much classic what Freud or Douglas told us about. So I was very much interested, like you, in the fact that humor is so multi-layered and so multi-directional in a sense. I remember, one example that I used in my book, Estonian editor used in Picker, used to tell that I always draw something for what I could go to prison, but in a way, that they cannot uncover so easily. So that's what humor cartoons can do. They always have those multiple layers, and you can laugh, and the other who is a butt of laughter will not be able to disclose it. So yes, it's an amazing contribution. I love your chapter very much. The other chapter that I use, and this is especially relevant, of course, to American students, is a chapter on Trump. And I can just remind others that in that chapter, there is a quote that Trump was not afraid of anything, but he was afraid of laughter, or comedy, probably that was. So this is also about, the book is about the power of humor and its implications. And we know from multiple examples, like Charlie Hebdo, the Parisian journal, where 12 editors were executed for drawing of Prophet Muhammad cartoons. that it could have, deadly power, that laughter could have deadly power. So this is a very, very interesting subject. And humor, as Mark Twain said, its sources are in sorrow and despair, not otherwise there would be no humor, and there is no humor in heaven, according to Mark Twain. So I guess, your transition from violence and torture and suffering and pain to humor is not accidental, right? It's about, those deep layers of human existence that you were able to capture in your work. So thank you, Jana. It has been.
Thank you, Neringen. I will call on you again.
Sure.
I'm gonna skip this for lack of time. I do start the second our book with a quote from Chaplin, and because Chaplin for me is someone who uses the humor for human rights purposes as well. But I want to give you example of Mukul's humor, just one particular kind of thick ethnographic moment. I love these, and this is from time of when Czech was in the hospital, and 3 other friends were visiting him every Sunday. They asked me if I want to go with them, and I have witnessed very closely their a sense of humor. In the car, they asked me whether I know that Czech was the author of their hymn, their song, and they were singing the song. And then one of the Mukuls said, "Guess what? I'm gonna go in the hospital. You wait outside, and we will." I will tell him that STB is here and that he got life sentence. And I remember this feeling on my throat that he's proposing what? This man got life sentence and he's gonna go in a hospital and joke about you got life sentence and they're here and they're outside waiting for you. And so that was a kind of humor that the sort of this the absurdity built in, but also the dryness and a sort of cynical edge to it. And so I write about Mukuls as they are in the late life, and how very much at the dawn of their Mukulhood, they have left themselves in Czech society. They are now, or they were now when I was writing, most of them are gone by now, but they were isolated community in many ways, continue that even after prison, but they had each other. And this is, very, I was thinking about how do you finish this book? Just it seems like such a journey, even for me, listening over and over to life histories. When a humor topic came, it was liberating for me as a writer and researcher as well, to get through that, because it was kind of secondary reliving for me, trying to understand in depth their perspective from their point of view. And so in the end, I decided that I'm going to just describe what it's like to be in late life, aging as a Mukul in Czech Republic then. And I described in a great detail this visit to the hospital and the moment then when Vojta really went into the hospital and brought Czech out, wrapped in the robe, they'd sit on a wheelchair, and they were waiting for him. And they knew that he loved bourbon and cigarette, which he couldn't have in hospital. So they pour him bourbon and light his cigarette, and his face opened up and shine, and then he began. But I could see, he saw me and he saw them, and it was as if Mukulhood could never leave him. He began to talk about Mukulhood again, but yet it was in a company of others. And so at the end, this is what I give, this very, story of aging Mukuls that have each other, whether it's through painful memories of waking up with the nightmares from last night, to then finding lightness in their sense of humor. And so this may be a good time to stop and turn it to you if you have questions to me or Neringa as a partner in the book. And yeah, thank you for listening and having me again. And it has been now many years. I somehow thought the story would die in the library somewhere deep. So I was first asked to present this book publicly in Library of Congress in DC. I presented also in Václav Havel's library in Prague. I share with my students when I teach linguistic courses. And I was on the radio, Prague radio once with the story. So, but not really terrible promotion. So this doesn't mean to really, for me, it's just a sharing story and story that they wanted to be shared. I think to them that was very important. They did not find justice back in Czech courts, but they found justice in and hope in sharing their story. So when I present stories, I don't have any anxiety because it's really not about me. I always feel like I'm just a channel for this story in a way. So
Well,
thank you again.
Thank you, Jana, very much for the important and excellent presentation. I must say I had actually a little bit personal feelings during your talk because my father was one of the Mukkels in late 1940s. And he sort of, I think the effect on him it had that he sort of lived all his rest of his life in sort of like internal exile, as he called it. Mm-hmm. And yeah, and the humor, was an important part.
Maybe what would be interesting, since you have worked, to hear what was it like to be a daughter of. I know that there was a dissertation written about daughters of political prisoners. You may know about the book.
I don't know, no. Well, in his case, I think it was, he didn't talk about it, I must say. I think
you said he couldn't, or no?
I'm so sorry. I was not more curious about it. When he said some little things, but then, I was too young and I was dating guys, and I was not. And he may be also for my security. He was not telling me things. It was very bizarre, schizophrenic times in the communist and the communists. So anyway, let's open the forum for if people have any questions or comments.
Well, this was very difficult to listen to, but very important. And thank you so much for the research you did, and having had the inspiration to see those men at that cafe and taking the initiative. And I guess what I want to comment on is I moved to Prague in 1990, and I was there right after the Iron Curtain fell and Velvet Revolution. And, it was a fascinating time, but as a foreigner, I didn't dare probe. And I did try to speak the language, but even if I was totally fluent, I wasn't there during the dark era. And I found it, I'm researching it now actually, because finally my friends that I've kept are telling me stories 30, 35 years later, and I think I really, that term you just used, internal exile. So even people who maybe just lived a marginal life, without going to the mines or, I'll just quickly say, one of my closest I was there I started a business. One of my closest friends and employees said, "Oh, Anne-Marie, I never told you this, but our family my grandfather went to the Yakimov mines and he was unfairly," she just poured out all this information. But again, it took 30 years for her to, well, what, trust me or feel she was healed enough to talk about it. So yes, these are really important stories, and I want to get your book. And could you maybe comment maybe on what information you have from an anthropological point of view on revealing this to a foreigner, or to a American coming in, all excited about, oh, I'm going to start a business, and having to be very careful, respectful and careful about not asking too many questions, and certainly not joking. I don't think it would be my place, talk about joking, but where can we get your book, and any comments you have on not being Czech and having these kind of relationships where you want to be close to people who have suffered so much?
Well, I think, first of all, you can get the book on Amazon, or you can, if you want to contact me directly, I will be happy also to help with getting, usually around Christmas, book got insanely expensive. I don't make any money from the book because it's academic, but it got insanely expensive. And I want to offer you, anybody who's interested, and if you like to contact me, I'm happy to get you author's discounted version, but I usually get that off, or I can't afford my own book right now, but they only publish it in a hard copy, and it's now published on demand. So it's, I think, sold out, but they would, and I would be happy to assist with that, probably for some discount if you want to. And I also, when I went to Prague, I donated a book to archive in current history, Institute for Current History in Prague. So they have a copy. So that's one place I know, and libraries should. So you could also demand it through libraries. In terms of foreigners understanding, I think for one thing that I think when things are happening that changed me dramatically, how this work changed me, who I lived in the country, but I did not experience this in first person. But what changed me, what connects with me, was I remember growing up, being a teenager, and a meeting for the first time with someone who was a daughter of immigrant who came to the country, and we had lunch together. And I said to her, all these years, I was feeling, how could you watch and do nothing from outside? And so I think that was my connection to prisoners, where they felt that towards their own people. How could you watch and do nothing? There's the kind of desperate feeling, something must happen, somebody must do to see the injustice. And then, as I said, I think there was something incredible gift. They lost family, their own family, maybe their own society or citizenship, but they gained through this pain a new kind of family, new kind of bonds, or bonding or camaraderie that nobody else will get. And so to me, that was a peaceful to know that they had each other, many of them. That sort of elevated that heavy sense of the ones who survived in any way. But I'm not sure if I'm being helpful, Anne-Marie, in answering you how foreigners can see this. But I think one thing I would say, in my book, I do talk about history, and I do talk about how different times during the communism in Czechoslovakia had a different kind of levels of freedom or atmosphere. I think that for people who experience 50s, it was hardcore Stalinism. People die, were killed, were tortured, and they were in the later, but 60s was a time when a lot of people could taste a little bit of freedom and could travel, and things were published, and that's a very different generation. And then, of course, Russians came in 68 and occupied again, and there was a sense of crash. But the 60s people now are still alive. My parents' generation, they don't remember Second World War, but they remember when Russian tanks came and when their sense of liberation and freedom was pushed down or raped in a way. And and then there is 70s and 80s, my generation, that lived in a time of this gray secrecy where everything was hidden. People of my generation don't know these details. I only know it because I did research, or I had some friends like Milu or some others who I asked, but never so systematically. So even my generation, I'm in my mid-50s, that generation has no clue about the experiences of these people. And then there is a very young generation, their 20s now, that are asking and want to know. I think my generation, as I experienced when I went back and presented, is still very much in denial, or kind of not really want to. It's too painful, maybe unrecovered, maybe pain that was there they didn't know about. But I think it is a generation that's in their 20s now who wants to know what is the truth, what happened. And there's a new kind of revival of young people, students. In Charles University, a couple of them I met in Yakimov on some of the returns, who are writing now about this and are curious. But we have some more questions, so I will turn it back.
We have Nani Valentine asking to be heard.
Hello, and I'm really grateful that you have laid out the stories and done this work. I wrote in the chat that I'm American, but I married a guy from Brno and lived in Prague for 20 years from those early post change of regime days.
Wow.
And we worked as psychotherapists, and I have the feeling that what you are doing academically is a really important part of that healing of old trauma. And as I and my husband Jan saw it, many of the younger people that Czechs we were working with were carrying the traumas of the previous generations. So there was this intergenerational power that would come through the difficulties of the youngest generation. But the stories would come, and they were difficult, but they lightened the experience of this younger generation, who were really weighed down by the victimhood of the previous generations. And I started to feel that a certain identity in the Czech Republic when I was there about we have been victims, that was unhelpful politically or on the world stage, is actually able to be helped by this sort of reckoning or opening of stories that are extremely difficult and were sometimes too difficult in the early 90s when I started as a psychotherapist. and the post-communist regimes were not, in my view, very willing to open up much of what needed to be opened up. So I just feel that what you are doing is really helpful in this regard, that it is a tiny piece of a certain kind of intergenerational healing and historical recovery from trauma that is really, really important.
Thank
So
you.
no question there, just much in the way of thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. It makes me think that, you know, I have kind of given up on idea of publishing it in Czech. It makes me think that maybe I should pursue it. It has been discussed with me, and I tried a little bit, but it didn't go any further. So it may be something I should do.
Oh, I really think you should do. And I think even the photos exude such strength and beauty. And so what these political prisoners were able to develop at a soul level, what they were able to develop of soul is quite remarkable, but mainly only if there was enough support for the recovery from the traumatic aspects, it seems to me.
I wonder if you could do a play.
I was actually thinking, my daughter is a playwright, and I was trying to convince her to do that.
Yeah.
But I could totally see it. Yes.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah, Patricia Figuera has a.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Kopelent, for your excellent presentation. You described the same thing that happened in other countries. I am a physician. I trained in the US. My professor was from Romania, and she was telling me the same horror stories that you were mentioning in the first part. And he mentioned that her husband was reading the L'Express, the French newspaper, and they did a meeting for all the faculty of the School of Medicine to denounce him for reading capitalist newspapers or material. It was horrible. And in China, it's the same. So the writers write science fiction. So in a way, they try to present the reality in a different way. And I can tell a little story in Chile. In time of Allende, who was a Marxist, Fidel Castro was invited to Chile, and he was there for around 1 month. And some friends of mine in the University of Concepcion, in the southern part of Chile, they expressed, oh, you know, Fidel Castro is coming to Chile. And they organized, they thought, why we organized that Fidel Castro earlier? So they make a pantomime with the people disguised as a Fidel Castro with like a comitive, and they made a charade. So people were hailing him, but the person in the door were saying, oh, you are such a nasty person. And all the people that were waiting for Fidel Castro, they were gone. Fortunately, they will escape. There was a humor without punishment for them, but I saw your connection. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's unfortunately all that is still very current and alive, and political prisoners all over the world are going through similar traumas. And this is just one snippet of what the humanity is going through. Of course, this leads to a parallel with what's happening in Ukraine now and Russia. And why is this repeat? Why does history keeps repeating itself? Because these stories we will hear 20 years from now, fresh ones.
Yeah, Unfortunately, I would want to say that courts like in Den Haag or Nuremberg trials can stop this, but they can't. And the idea of social justice can hold it accountable, but not prevent violence.
Yeah.
But I think, there are many levels of violence. And when I presented this, I was curious. In 2017, I went to Czech for the first time to present the book and project. And when I was presenting in Václav Havel's library in Prague, some people from academic community came, mostly historians. Some of them work in the Institute of Communist Regime Crimes. And they, it was interesting for me to see how they responded to some of my conceptualizing of this. They saw it as a history. And they, for example, one of the area they had a problem with was that I talk about how I talk about archive and how I talk about archive being a place of fiction, not place of truth. And I took a very extreme relativist perspective on this STB archive, and they didn't like it. And we had a kind of a heated conversations about this, and it came down to the fact that they were involved in a process where people applied for rehabilitation and compensation in form of money, and the system was set up that if you had any kind of a negative mentioning in a file that you were part of the regime, you're not eligible for a financial in a way, a compensation. And that it was specifically related to health, for example, uranium mines, cause terrible health issues. And so this was a big part of reconciliation process in Czech, where the government was issuing money to prisoners, ex-prisoners, and historians were asked to be involved in this kind of approving the purity of the prisoner. And I found it ridiculous from point of view of someone who knows that this is not this is impossible task, and that we have to talk about how this purity is construct and doesn't really exist. And they didn't want to accept that. Now, of course, if I was in their skin, I understand. But in the same time, I thought it was the worst punishment for prisoners to go through that process of proving that they were clean. And I'm talking now in time of post-regime.
Yeah. So I think it's an ongoing process, and especially in the Czech Republic, I think the self-reflection must be happening, and is happening, hopefully, because they still didn't come to terms with the past, this communist past, because too many people were passive or active in this. In the regime.
I know. And, also in Czech Republic, academia is very controlling, and how you tell the story and who tell the story, it's always important. So there are politics now. And I noticed that there are also now, I have no stake in none of this. I just came in as someone who have no stake in politics of Czech academia, but I could see how there are politics in who tells the story and how is story told.
Yeah.
So that was discouraging too. That's why I didn't push books too hard, because I was a little discouraged by this.
So I want to, if nobody else has questions, we might end up on this. Okay, well, thank you everyone very much for coming.